Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session on decarbonising the Global South. It's very exciting to have this discussion this afternoon because this is a new research area for Bruegel. We're just starting up a new line of work in collaboration with the Centre for Economic Policy Research and other research centres, and also because it's a very hot political topic. Earlier today, during his lecture on the future of trade, Richard Baldwin talked about moving from an exchange of concessions logic to a saving humanity logic when it comes to trade negotiations and trade governance. We could think of that being true in an even greater extent when it comes to the question of decarbonising the global economy. This is something that cannot be done by one country on its own or even one continent on its own because the atmosphere doesn't care with where carbon emissions comes from. The key thing is how many there are and how fast we can reduce them on different continents. So this session is going to look at this question of how to move to the saving humanity logic and to overcome the collective action problems, the free rider problems, and other difficulties that have beset the questions about climate finance, but also about changing technology and changing economic models to move to a climate neutral economy globally. Fortunately, we have four very interesting speakers to help us along this path. We're going to start with an overview of the issues and the many different ways of thinking about this from Professor Beatriz Veda Di Mauro from the Centre for Economic Policy Research. We will then have the perspective from multilateral international financial institutions, Multilateral Development Bank, as well, from Dr. Li Bo, who's joining us here live in Brussels, which is really super. We'll have the view from the European Commission, thanks to Deputy Director General Marketa Jager, who's joining us from Directorate General International Partnerships, which is doing a lot of the EU's thinking on the question of partnerships with other countries on decarbonisation. And we're also going to have on the screen behind us Dr. Suman Berry, who's Vice Chair of the National Institution for Transforming India, which is the government of India's economic and social development think tank, and who's done a lot of very important thinking ahead of the G20 summit due very shortly in New Delhi. So it's fantastic to have these very different perspectives on this large question. So we'll start off by considering the whole overview. Where are we now in terms of global carbon emissions, where they're emitted, and what kinds of tools might be needed, what kinds of instruments might need a retrofit from their original purpose. So over to you, Professor Veda Di Mauro.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Bruegel for this kind invitation to the annual meetings. It's a wonderful occasion to be talking about something that, as Heather was saying, is on many, many minds, if not in everybody's these days. So I am going to show a few slides. I am assuming, or I am pretty sure that most of you know everything that is on them, but that you have not seen it in this fashion, because it is a rather visual presentation. And I have also added a little piece to the title, not only decarbonizing the Global South, which assumes that it's highly carbonized right now, but also not carbonizing it as it grows. It's a dual challenge. But let's start with the question, who is in the Global South? I have started to use this word more and more because it's used everywhere, but it's not so clear what it includes or not. So here, according to the definition of the United Nations Finance Center on South-South cooperation, it is a pretty big chunk of the world which is in the South. It's not necessarily a geographical definition only. Notable, it does not include Mexico, but it does include China. So that already raises a few questions about what is it that we think about when we're talking about the South. But the general picture is one of a world in which there are two blocks. Now, as Heather already mentioned in the introduction, the carbon budget itself is not something that is regional, it's not country-wise, it is global, meaning whatever emissions that we concentrate in the atmosphere will have global implications. And moreover, since the temperature increase is a linear, almost linear proportion to the accumulated carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere, it is possible to calculate, and that's what's done on this table, how much we still have to go. How much is the remaining carbon budget? So I always want to show this table. It's from the IPCC, and it shows the main numbers to keep in mind. So if we want to, what it is saying is the following. If we want to stick to 1.5, then we have about, let's say, half a degree to go, because 1 degree is already in the bag, or more precisely in the atmosphere. And there is a range of uncertainty, which is expressed in these probabilities, which give us a certain total additional carbon emissions that we can afford in order to, if we still want to stick to 1.5. So the answer to the question, if we wanted to stick to 1.5 with high probability, meaning 83%, it's not high in statistical terms. For economists, we like to have higher certainties. But if we wanted to do that, then it's 300. Gigatons worldwide is the answer. If we are a bit more generous and think, well, okay, let's take more risk, then it's 500. So those are the two, in fact, that I tend to use. But note that this is already a few years old. And we are using up this budget. Currently, the world is going at the speed of about 40 gigatons per year. So this budget is being exhausted rather quickly, and this once again just should highlight the size not only of the challenge but also the global dimension of it. And I would submit that any solution that we are thinking about somehow has to add up to these, let's say 500 and not much more. So what is the current 40 gigatons? What do they look like if we size the countries, if we scale them by their contribution to annual emissions today? So clearly China is the biggest contributor, followed by the US, and then next already comes Europe. What is also notable, if you look at the map in this constellation, or in this scaling, is that a lot of the global south is not existent. In fact, Africa is basically not there, except for South Africa. So this is where is it coming from right now? But then if we look at, and that basically suggests that the where it's coming from right now is that there is a lot of challenge and a lot of investment that needs to be made in order to decarbonize the places where there is a lot of emissions. But on the other hand, if we look at where are the consequences largest and where will the adaptation needs be largest, then it is almost, it's not quite, but it's almost a reverse picture. Here, Africa is very much on the map. And I have something a little bit similar that then scales it by population, then India becomes really, really big. But there's two more points I wanted to make before talking about a possible way to think about the benchmark for any solution. So there is also the problem that there are still a lot of fossil fuels in the ground. And this is an estimate from an article in Nature that tries to say, okay, if we stay within the global budget, how much can be extracted, or put differently, how much has to remain in the ground? And the way to read this is, if you look at the coal at the lowest, is that most of coal in the ground should remain in the ground. It's a little bit less for gas and oil, but those are things to remember. There is still a lot of resources, and yes, Africa has also a lot of resources that would have to remain in the ground in order for targets to be achieved. And another Another dimension that I find is not unimportant is the fact that emerging markets have much younger infrastructure. In particular, this comes again to energy and electricity generation. And retiring that in an organic way will take longer. So the pathway of emissions for emerging markets is higher than the one for advanced countries. So put differently, for advanced countries, it's easier. Even though we have most of the emissions, in a way it's easier to replace existing old generators and infrastructure with newer one, which is cleaner. So let me put us just briefly through a thought experiment, which can serve as a benchmark for if we wanted to, if we could, implement a global cap and trade. I'm not saying here we're doing pricing of carbon, because of course there could be an equivalent of that, but I'm now just doing a cap and trade globally, in which the initial allocation of all the remaining carbon rights is equal. We could start from there, right? For those of you who know Edgeworth boxes, an initial allocation that is equal per person, personal life. I'm not taking account of not people who are not born yet. And the 500 gigatons, then, more or less divided by about 8 billion people, gives more or less 60 tons per head. So I think it's an important number to remember, because then we can put it into relationship to our individual carbon footprint, but it also will show how this differs. Right now, the global average, so 40 divided by 800, is about 5 tons per head. But the starting points are very, very different. So if you live in the US, on average per annual and per head, you are emitting about 16 tons. If you live in India, it's about 2 tons. And if you live in Kenya, on average, it's half a ton. So this shows you the scope for how much there could be climate finance through trade in such a global carbon market that I have designed here by equal allocation. Now, of course, you can deviate from this equal allocation. We can think about it differently. But as a benchmark, I think these numbers are useful. And as a last point, I would like to compare that with what the implied allocation of the remaining 500 gigatons is in Paris. If I interpret Paris as saying everybody has to go to 1.5 in a similar, speed doesn't matter, but everybody has to go to net zero, and I attribute the shares of what is remaining to the countries according to what they need to mitigate. So the example here, the EU right now should mitigate, is contributing about 7.7% of emissions. So I give the EU 7.7% of the remaining 500 gigatons, and then I divide that per capita. So that's what is happening here on this chart. So the EU basically would get 88 tons, which is a bit more than the 60 on average. But notice it's interesting that the US, of course, gets most because they are the most intensive emitters. But also China and Russia get quite a large allocation because they are quite large emitters. And again, Africa is not getting much under this kind of exercise. Why is this an interesting exercise? To me, it just highlights that we really need to be thinking hard about solutions that are at scale. And Africa, I think, especially for the European Union, should be the continent that is really the most in scope. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic to have that overview in just thinking about where we are now, because there are issues of scale there, there are issues of justice there, because we haven't even thought about historical emissions, who's responsible for what's already up there in terms of the stock of emissions. And of course, it's vital to remember that An ideal carbon budget would, of course, require carbon to be priced. And at the moment, only about a third of global carbon emissions are priced in any way. And that doesn't include, for example, the United States doesn't price its carbon emissions. So the leap that's needed in terms of policy thinking, in terms of financial flows, is also a conceptual leap in this respect. Also vital in terms of the question of climate justice, the fact that the figures for current emissions look at what's emitted on the territory of, for example, Europe, continental Europe and the United States. But as very large consuming economies, these economies are also responsible for a large number of embedded emissions in their imports. So basically goods, in particular, that are produced in other countries, especially the global south, which are then exported to Europe and the US. Those aren't accounted for in those two. So it's a great thought experiment. It's a very important basis for this conversation. And there are also other dimensions that we'll need to bring in at some point. So I'd like to come now to Dr. Lee, Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, because you've done a lot of thinking about the finance side of this. Very interested in your views on how to move forward.
Thank you, Heather, for inviting me. I just came from Nairobi today. I was in Africa attending the African Climate Summit for the last couple of days. We had a lot of interesting discussion. I think the question for me is climate finance. We have been, thinking and working on climate finance in the last couple of years. The way we see, climate finance, we can see from different angles. From the supplier of capital angle, we can talk about official assistance, private sector investment. That's one angle. Another angle is from the receiver end. We can talk about domestic resource mobilization and international support. And regardless of which angle we take, we realize that a lot of support, a lot of help is needed from international community for developing countries such as Africa. Let me highlight three areas that I think are very important for international community to work together to support the developing countries if we want to achieve the agreement, the Paris Agreement goals. The first area is what I call legal, policy, and regulatory reforms. We need to support developing countries to establish a regulatory, a legal and policy framework that will be conducive for climate investment, both for mitigation and also for adaptation. And this could include carbon pricing or some equivalent measure, because we know carbon pricing can be politically difficult in many countries, but we can talk about the equivalent measures such as fee-based, such as emissions trading, such as even green subsidy. So that's one example of the kind of policy we can help developing countries to think about and to establish. Another example will be governance. To gain investor confidence, governance reforms are also very important to promote transparency, to fight against corruption. This also require a lot of reforms, and the international community can do a lot in helping developing countries. The second area I want to highlight is about capacity building, technical assistance. International community can also help a lot in terms of improving the availability of data, in terms of increasing transparency, and also in terms of incorporating climate into macroeconomic framework, like what we do at IMF, in terms of fiscal framework, in terms of financial framework. We help a lot of developing countries to incorporate climate risk into their fiscal, into their macroeconomic framework. So a lot can be done. Also, international community can help developing countries to build a pipeline of projects, because many countries we go, we see that they don't have a pipeline of projects, a pipeline of bankable projects, a pipeline of investable projects. That requires a lot of capacity building, a lot of preparation. And MDBs, in particular, are very good at helping developing countries. I'm talking about multilateral development banks like World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank. They're very good at helping countries to prepare bankable projects. And that's mostly technical assistance. So that's the second area. And finally, in terms of what the international community can do to help climate finance, is to think about how to design innovative financing structures that can help de-risk or partially de-risk for private capital to come in. And this could include, at the macro level, IMF. IMF is a macro de-risker, right? We try to help the countries to establish a credible macro framework so that investors will feel this country can be relatively stable at the macro economic level. That's what we do at IMF. But macro is only one aspect. There are also a lot of micro risks. And we need catalytic capital. We need capital that are willing to take the first loss, like equity. Mm-hmm. We also need guarantees sometimes in order to de-risk. We also need credit enhancement sometimes because many of these countries, they have very low rating. And their papers will not be interested by traditional institutional investors of the West because their ratings are too low. And we need to find ways to enhance their credit, to raise their rating. So all this, we can put into the bucket of de-risking. And there is also the risk of foreign exchange, for international capital, for international investors. They are worried about the exchange rate risk. Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the major challenges for international private investors. And how can we deal with it? How can we help de-risk? How can we help with FX hedging? How can public sector help? International institutions help to deal with this FX risk. So these three areas, we think are very important if international community want to help developing countries, the global south, to scale up climate finance. And IMF is doing our part in that process. And I can talk about more about what we are doing at IMF later, but I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. No, that's very, very helpful to understand it. That there are some very familiar challenges in terms of financing for development in particular, but then there are also some quite specific ones with regard to climate. Now, this is familiar territory also for the European Commission. And Marketa Jager, you've been looking at this with regard to the international partnerships that the Commission is responsible for in terms of development policy, the aid relationships, but also there's been an attempt to reformulate those in recent years. So how do you see it in terms of how can the European Union in particular best support decarbonisation elsewhere in the world?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for this very interesting presentation and for inviting European Commission. Indeed, everything the previous speaker have said, it's true. And as you all know, and it was on the agenda this afternoon already, the Green Deal is the EU basically growth agenda. I know you had Kurt here, and I would also like to congratulate Bruel for your paper on the governance on the Green Deal. Again, it has 1, 2, 3 joint, and then the agency and everything that you are proposing. So basically, what we are trying to say is that, of course, the decarbonisation is a priority within EU, but also globally. So what we are trying to do globally is really the key on our agenda, because we all know that the climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution affects most vulnerable. We have seen also on the slides that the global south, let's say, will be the most affected with the impact. Therefore, I would like to present to you a couple of facts about our support, INPA support. So we will continue to support our partner countries in their climate ambitions, and Team Europe, meaning the EU plus member states plus EIB, continues to be the biggest climate provider, finance provider in the world. we are not only the biggest ODA donor in the world, 43% of ODA comes from EU, meaning 93 billion, but also we are the biggest climate finance provider. And let me just say that only for 2021, Team Europe committed 23 billion to tackle climate emergency in the partner countries. So that means that this is one of our biggest share. Also in our legislation and DICI, we have the hard target of 30% that we need to spend of all our amounts for the climate change. And our president added additional 4 billion to fight climate change. So I would really like to come back to Nairobi, maybe, because of course this week was the most important Africa Climate Summit, where our president also offered Africa to be the ally at the COP28 and really to work together on all issues of the agenda, because we do have the common and same interest when it comes to climate action. And that means that also we recognize the huge potential for renewable energy, clean hydrogen, and the partnership we do for planet and decarbonizing is a win-win partnership for everyone. So basically, I would like to have a second point, and that is that when talking about the global south, we need to recognize that global south is very full of diversity. So we cannot say that, we can put all the countries into the one basket, because it includes some of the world's top emitters and also, I would say, the most vulnerable to the climate change. And we also know, as you said, that Africa by itself, has a very low percentage when it comes to the emission. And of course, that also means that we need to do the differentiation when it comes to mitigation for action, that it's for the biggest emitters. And of course, we concentrate on adaptation when it comes to the most LDCs and vulnerable countries, because our action, as I said before, 23 billion, goes half to mitigation and half to adaptation. So here it comes what I would like to say on the financing. First of all, ODA will not solve the problem, so we cannot solve it with the public money, as my colleague from IMF has said. And basically what we need is really to increase the climate finance, but the question is how. So basically we need to make more links between the increased climate action and the review of the global financial architecture. And here I'm very happy that I have a distinguished speaker here, because we've been just in Cadiz discussing the new global architecture. We not only had a Paris summit, we are going to India. Our heads of states will meet in India this weekend, so we have high expectations for there. But also we are preparing for the SDG summit for UNGA. We will go to Marrakesh with the proposals for the change of architecture when it comes to World Bank and IMF. So here, on behalf of European Commission, I would like to make a pledge that really the fight against climate change and biodiversity will become really the priority for the World Bank and IMF as well. And here, of course, bring us all to the COP28, and when we will all gather in Dubai end of November, I do believe that we need to bring the solutions, and how we would like to bring the solution from the EU. We have a global gateway with the 300 billion offer to our partner countries when it comes also the fight of climate change, energy solution, and hard infrastructure, but also soft measures. But also we all know that the innovative finance, private sector, domestic resource mobilization, as you said, but really the public-private partnership is needed. But also not only grants, not only loans, not only blending, but we need the guarantees. So we have a guarantee in the European Union, it's called EFSD+, and where we have a flagship of the global green bonds, Plus, we do have the de-risking instrument for many, many other guarantees. I would say that we are putting together the 6 billion guarantee now. We are also working with IFC and others, international financial institutions. But with all that, I think that we can find the solutions that can not only add to the increase of the concessional finance, but innovative finance that we need for the solution, including the TCX. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to bring in a perspective directly from India, because Dr. Berry is located there and unfortunately couldn't join us here today, but it's great we have you on the screen, and thank you for making the time. So what's your perspective on this? You've been advising the government of India on how to think about decarbonisation over the period ahead. India, of course, is, as a per capita emitter, quite small, but as a cumulative emitter, a collective emitter, large. So in a way, India sits at the very crux of the different dimensions of this issue. What's your view on the way forward in terms of thinking about global decarbonisation, not just region by region or country by country?
Thanks, Heather, and it is indeed a great pleasure and an honor indeed to be invited to Bruegel. My association with Bruegel now extends over 3 directors. I first was associated with Bruegel when I was at Shell, when Jean was the director. Guntram offered me the non-resident fellowship, and Jeromin has reached out to me to participate in the session. I'm very sorry that this has to be virtual, partly because of the G20 meetings coming up this weekend. Let me start by first reacting to what Beatrice had to say, because she and I were at a conference organized by the Peterson Institute in Washington in June. She made this presentation there, but it has been amplified in significant ways, and those are a jumping off point for some of the points I wanted to make as well. So I think the 2 things that are the 2 points that are striking in what Beatrice had to say was, as it were, her articulating the issue of climate justice, which actually has not found official traction, to my knowledge, in the various COPs, but is very kind of deeply felt, I think, in the Global South. She also raised, actually, the question of who is the Global South, and I think a lot of the constraints on, as it were, climate action in the North do revolve around the role and status of China, and I'll come to that in a minute. The third very important point that she made was this conceptual model of, as it were, assume global cap and trade. What would constitute a reasonable allocation of the available carbon budget, and how does that differ from what is likely to happen? I'm picking up on all of these because they are central to, I think, what India has attempted to do through its G20 presidency. Many of you know that the G20 leaders process really was invented by the G7 at the time of the global financial crisis, when an existing ministerial level meeting was escalated to the leaders level as a kind of firewall to a collapse in the global financial system, which seemed unstoppable, particularly because we were in a transition from George W. Bush to Obama. I'm making this point because coming out of that experience, there was a commitment to strong, balanced, sustainable, and inclusive growth. So that, to my mind, is why the G20 leaders meet. But it has to be said that partly because of COVID and the responses to COVID, few people would argue that the G20 has delivered on its core mandate. And so that is part of what India, succeeding Indonesia and following on from Brazil, is attempting to do in its through its G20 presidency, namely two things. One, to represent the global south, which is what we're talking about here. But second, also to indicate the asymmetry in the outcomes for the global north and the global south. So the challenge then facing in India and facing other parts of the global south is how to raise living standards while containing your carbon footprint. Now, I don't want to take up the time right now on all the things India is doing. You'll perhaps read a lot about it in the G20, but just finally let me come to, as it were, what the EU can do and how Europe can assist decarbonization in the South. I think we've heard a lot of the solutions in the presentation made both by the DMD of the fund and also by the Commission. I just want to draw attention to the larger, if you like, financial architecture, by which I mean that, certainly seen from the point of India, but the calculations have been done for other countries, what we are talking about is a big increase in investment over and above what countries of the South are able to do at the moment. And this investment needs, yes, financing, but it also needs financial stability in the global monetary order. I'm reminded of the fact that during the Marshall Plan and also the rise of the NICs, countries routinely ran current account deficits of 4-6%. Turkey is perhaps still doing this. What I can say is that India, given the status of the global safety net at the moment, wouldn't risk doing that. Also, the reason it's linked with the increase in investment is that you can't really absorb real resources without running a large current account deficit. And so, yes, I accept that the multilateral development banks need reform. I would say, though, that what we see, and we'll see what comes out of the G20, is that on the one hand, countries in the South, let me take India as an example, are being asked to make 30-year bets on a different energy model. But when it comes to, for example, capital increases of the MDBs, we're told, oh no, let's just wait to see if they sweat their capital a little harder, and then when that's been shown, we will increase their capital. So I'm saying that the G7, unfortunately, we are in a situation where the G20 is not, it has become somewhat divided into the G7 and the others. The EU is very influential in the G7, and I would say that on issues like increasing the capital of the MDBs, in coming up with a more robust safety net, in giving an assurance to the developing countries that if their investment is up to par, making more of a reality of the various contingent financing facilities of the fund. I think that's how the EU, acting through, as it were, agencies in which it's influential, could make a big difference. I'm probably exceeded my time. Thank you very much, Heather.
Thank you very much. So we have got a bit of time for questions, for further questions. So do use Slido. Also those of you who are in the room, because from up here it's actually really hard to see you. So you're more likely to get your question asked if you put it on Slido. You need to use the hashtag Global South, and we've got a number of questions that have come in already. Now, I could group some of these questions together around one of the points I wanted to raise in any case, which is about the role of green value chains in providing revenues for decarbonisation. So this is the sort of chicken and egg question about decarbonisation, that basically when you decarbonise, you have an opportunity to produce more green products, which can be sold into markets that are already doing carbon pricing, for example, the European Union, so that when CBAM arrives, if you're already producing with renewable energy, you can sell your products into the European market. The US may also move into pricing taxing carbon at the border, in which case that will also provide an incentive. But of course, countries need to decarbonise first before they're able to produce those products, sell them abroad, avoid the problems of current account deficit that Suman was just raising, and produce a revenue stream which they can use for further decarbonisation. What you want is for that virtuous circle to start working, that the decarbonisation basically lifts countries up the value chain in terms of what they're able to produce, and they're also using renewable energy and a decarbonised economy to produce goods which will then provide revenues which are essentially a lot bigger because of the pricing of carbon crowding out of the market the products that are produced with dirty energy. So how do we get to that state of affairs? It's really a sequencing issue as well as an issue of the tools to be applied. So one way that's often been provided is, one suggestion is, well, that's going to happen through the IFIs being primarily focused on this transition. A couple of the questions that you can see there are being a little bit kind of raising questions around this. Is it sensible to expect the Global South to be able to grow without carbonising more? What's the role of technology, and will that technology mainly come from the Global North, or do we expect to see technology transfer? And I mean, one of the big points raised in one of the sessions earlier was that one of the supposedly Global South economies, namely China, actually has plenty of technology available for low carbon solutions. So these are big questions around both what does the new industrial geography look like with having green value chains, and where countries sit on it, and that will be a rearrangement of the value chains that we see now. And is that going to happen fast enough to provide the revenues for the scale of decarbonisation that Beatrice was starting us off thinking about originally. So would you like to come in on that first, Bo, because you've thought about this with relation to the IMF's instruments, which are kind of being retrofitted to a different situation, but also because this relates very much to a development paradigm that is also changing. And then I'll come to Marietta to ask about how the Commission thinks about this.
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Just quickly, a couple of points. One is on the green value chain and technology transfer. We think that's something it has to happen if we want to make Global South to successfully mitigate, but also develop. And we do think that FDI is an important channel for technology transfer. And in the process of FDI, we can help developing countries to be integrated into the green value chain, but at the same time to receive the kind of technology that is needed for mitigation or adaptation. So FDI is very important. And also FDI can help fill some of that gap in climate finance. Because if you look at the renewable energy, the energy sector, the demand, the need is tremendous. Some people estimate, we need $1.7 trillion investment per year in Global South in terms of green energy, renewable energy. Right now, what is actually happening is only less than 1/3 of that, like $540 billion a year. So we need a lot more investment in Global South in terms of renewables and green energy. And that investment has to come either from domestic resource mobilization, from domestic capital market, or from international market. And of course, FDI can be an important part of that, that investment. And of course, also play the role of technology transfer. My other point is that the idea of green value chain and technology transfer are important, but they still face the same kind of constraints that I talked about previously in terms of climate finance. They're going to face the same capacity constraint. They're going to face the same governance constraint. They are going to face the same FX risk for international investors. So that's why, we urge international community to come together to think about those three buckets of things that we can do to help Global South in terms of, legal and policy reform, in terms of technical assistance, and in terms of specific financing solutions, financing arrangement that can help de-risk or partially de-risk for private capital. I stop here.
Yeah, no, it's a huge question, and of course it's tricky also, both for the financing question and also more broadly for the whole question of development. Now, development policy is famously path dependent. It doesn't tend to change very fast. There's been a reframing of development policy at EU level by Commissioner Opelainen and the Commission President von der Leyen. But some of the fundamental constraints in terms of development are still very much there. So I'd like to just ask your view, Marietta, on the very different context in which development policy is now being practiced by the EU, where there's the deforestation regulation and other new trade instruments. There's also, of course, CBAM coming, being phased in from 2026 onwards, and that has already led to a very, shall we say, rigorous and robust dialogue with the trade partners of the European Union. How does that what kinds of results does that have in terms of the sorts of partnership it's possible to offer with the EU as a huge aid donor, but one that tends to rely on macrofinancial assistance, budget support, essentially assistance to governments. And of course now we're in a much more complicated picture, both on the trade side and also in terms of bringing in private finance.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can answer all these questions in a couple of minutes that I have, but I will try. So first of all, we all agree that the planet is basically burning and growing, and that action is needed. So that the decarbonization, or even better, as the colleague professor said before, carbonization is something that we should have in mind. So we put all our action tools and financial resources into that action, not only from the legislative, but mainly from our development perspective, that it's called international partnership. So what we are trying to build is real partnership with our partner countries, mainly following the priorities that I just mentioned. So we go not only for the external part of the Green Deal, that of course you mentioned a couple of proposals, or I would say already adopted regulations on the deforestation, on the CBAM. And of course, we need to take that as an opportunity. We have a daily dialogue with our partner countries, with the technical assistance, with the colleagues traveling to the most affected countries to explain the purpose and to basically give not only the technical assistance part, but to see what kind of accompanied actions we can bring into implementation of those regulations, and also how to guide our partner countries, because it's, at the end of the day, it's a win-win situation, as I said. Before we had, for example, Cocoa Initiative in Ivory Coast. It was a great success. As you said, it is a value chain. So also in the energy value chain, as our president said in Nairobi, there is an absolute possibility of technological development, sharing of technologies, together with, of course, we have interest in the critical raw materials. That's why we are doing the memorandums with, for example, Kazakhstan on critical raw materials, or we do, the clean hydrogen memorandums. Just now, the latest one with Kenya that was endorsed in Nairobi. But also we have a green hydrogen with Chile, with Namibia. I mean, that is all in the paradigm that you mentioned. I mean, in terms of partnership, that we only can have a win-win situation together, because we can have a lot of initiatives, and at multilateral level, at the bilateral level. I mean, from the Green Great Wall to everything we put into the energy. We started decades ago with the, switch to green, Asia, Africa, electrify, etc., etc. But now we believe that all our really action needs to go not only in bringing in the private sector, but also, to work with the financial institutions in order to leverage the effect. And we would like to leverage the development impact in our partner countries that would then bring not only the growth and economic prosperity to Africa and other countries, but also basically bring into the matrix the whole green agenda together. Because we believe this is the same story, and only with, let's say, the 306-degree offer, as I mentioned before, with the Global Gateway and Team Europe approach, we can basically reach that goal, because we need to do it. I mean, I'm from Slovenia. We were flooded the whole summer. I can tell you that, the nature takes its way and the tool, and we have only one possibility, to work together in order to reach the decarbonization.
Yeah. Climate impacts are being felt everywhere now, yes. So, Suman, I want to come back to you with Jeremy Zettelmeyer's question, how to create financial instruments and incentives to retire high-carbon energy sources and compensate the losers, not only finance new investment. India, of course, has a very large coal capacity, and as Beatrice pointed out at the beginning, when the coal is still there in the ground and there's a mining industry, it can take a long time for renewables to price the coal out of the market unless there is a way of pricing carbon. So what's the way forward? What would you see as the possibilities for creating incentives to retire these kinds of high carbon sources?
I don't think that's the dialogue or that's the discussion within India at the moment. So there are advantages to aiming to grow at 6% a year, which is that at the increment, you can be investing in renewables, in newer energies. But I think that India has nowhere indicated that it is going to phase out its coal anytime soon, nor has it indicated that its reliance on oil and gas will be reduced significantly. So there is a big difference between an economy that aspires to grow at 6 and 7%, and with energy energy requirements growing at about 4%, and a mature economy like that of the EU or the US. Let me also just shift the focus a little bit to the point that Beatrice made, and that also came up in the Peterson conference, which is we see what large sums of money are being thrown in the way of subsidies under the IRA in the US. But Jason Furman, who was a commentator at that conference, it's an open conference, so I'm not betraying, indicated that despite all this money, there's very little likelihood that the US would attain its Glasgow targets. So the question really is, how much pressure is the EU putting on the US? And the notion that the US and the EU should be judging the climate performance of countries who've been given very little carbon space on, whether they need to face a trade barrier. No, it's no wonder that you're having, as you put it, robust discussions. I mean, I think the formulation that Beatrice put forward is the right one. Consider global cap and trade. And under global cap and trade, the allowances that would be provided to the South would be greater, and they would, at the moment, the policies are sort of internally inconsistent. You want them to grow, but you're putting trade barriers in their way and mucking up the global trading system. Is there coherence in these policies would be my question, but that's not the question that was asked.
Well, I think it's a great question to come to you, Beatrice,
Yeah.
especially around the political economy of creating a cap and trade system, because it's something that, for example, there was an attempt made to bring in such a policy in the United States a few years ago, which failed miserably, was completely undercut, and I wouldn't gain support now. So is it something where, as Suman was just saying, there needs to be some kind of transatlantic agenda to make it happen, maybe also because these are the two largest shareholders in the IFIs, or is it something that can be done country by country, region by region?
Well, the political economy of that is horrible. Almost as bad, I think a little bit less bad because people understand it better when they talk about quantities, but it would face, I guess, even more opposition than the carbon tax. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that this is going to happen, and definitely it would never happen at an individual level. We would never have a global carbon trade where we allocate to every individual some rights. If anything, it would happen at the country level or maybe even regional. But thinking further along those lines, I think, is the correct way to think about it, because there is the inbuilt bias in what I showed as being the implicit allocation of Paris is just so large that I think it just won't happen. I don't read that as an expression of climate injustice. I read it as an expression of infeasibility. This will not happen. We are not going to, and therefore I disagree just with one thing that you said, namely, this is not what is likely to happen. This is very likely what is not going to happen. And therefore, implicitly, we are saying we are not going to stick to Paris. We're not going to stick to that kind of budget. Mm-hmm. And we're saying that in many ways all the time. Basically, it doesn't add up to 500. It probably adds up to much more. And the question then becomes, how much more? And when you're thinking about solutions, some sort of smart design that has some carbon market linking up. The good thing is Europe has it, right? And is expanding it. So Europe is actually going the price way. Mm-hmm. And increasingly it will also generate revenues from this. Mm-hmm. And this will be visible, and this can be used to compensate losers. And now essentially we have to start thinking about a bigger type of European solution. And I think that's where I would have most hope that we could actually somehow limit the overall budget. The other way is, and you could interpret it, is as the US way. You just subsidize the hell out of green technology, and you hope that it becomes so cheap. Mm-hmm. That it just crowds out everything else, and coal stays in the ground by default because it's too expensive. But right now, that does not seem to be. I mean, you need a lot of hope in order to really bet on that way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course, there's the price of the solar panels and the wind turbines, but then there's also all of the other things you have to do that we've been talking about today. The grid infrastructure is really expensive. Yeah. I mean, solar panels are not that expensive, but grid infrastructure is very expensive, especially for the feeding in and so on. But yes, trying to think about it more holistically is a key. So we're about to be standing between people in the apéritif, which is not a good place to stand. Mm-hmm. So I just want to draw your attention to two further questions, which are really interesting, and suggest that we give a short, sharp answer on them, because we're clearly not going to finish this discussion today. today. One is from Jean Pisani-Ferry, which is really a kind of catch-22 about development. He says, decarbonisation essentially consists in substituting capital for fossil fuels. So it makes development more capital intensive. Many developing countries already struggle to finance their development. So is there thinking in the IFIs about ways to alleviate this constraint? Maybe we have a quick, some quick thoughts on that from this side.
There is an interesting paper you produced in IMF on the debt climate swap. So maybe you can talk about
so
that.
IMF website is the first
the
place to go.
conditions, because we have a couple of guarantees about that as well. And under certain conditions, we may be the way forward. But also a call to basically increase the capital of the multilateral development banks. European Commission is not a stakeholder, let me be clear, only in EIB and in EBRD. So that's why I can't say much about that, but clearly there are the solutions that we have discussed already with the World Bank and IMF. So I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I won't stand between the audience and the dinner, so I will let people to read that paper. I want to make just two quick points on this one. One is that equity capital may be both better than guarantee, because guarantee you have, socializing the loss and privatizing the gain, the kind of drawback. But when you have equity capital, you have a symmetry, right? You have basically socialize both the gain and the loss. But more importantly, there is too much debt already in developing countries.
Yeah.
And we need more equity investment. That's point number one. Point number two, public sector needs to take more calculated risk, including MDBs. If you look at some of the structures that MDBs did in the last 20 years, when the MDB takes the equity tranche of a green fund, they can typically achieve a lot of leverage in terms of attracting private capital, sometimes 5 times, sometimes 10 times. So if you want to scale up and crowd in private capital in large scale, public sector, including MDBs, need to take more risk, need to do more deals like that, basically taking the first loss capital, taking the equity tranche of funding structures. And I stop here.
And I would like to add that I fully agree. And in this regard, the EU really supports the position that we need to have first better banks and then the bigger ones. So just to be clear.
Yeah, thank you. Really great. So last rapid fire question for you, Beatrice, and for Suman is, so if we have this panel this time next year at the Bruegel annual meeting 2024, what's the question that this panel should be answering? What will be left from the G20 agenda after the Indian presidency as it moves on next year? And how can we advance this debate and actually start to get some movement? And we don't just get bogged down in the issues that have so far really hampered international progress on this. Is it about governance? Is it about new ideas? Or is it about a few bold governments actually moving forward and taking some of the risk? Suman, over to you first.
Well,
what should we be talking about?
The annual meeting will be before the US presidential election.
Good point.
I think the right question is, what should we be discussing after the US presidential election? And I'm being pretty serious about this. That said, I'm not that skilled in reading G20 communiques, but if what the EU representative has said open the check, if there is an indication that both because of the very successful meetings my Prime Minister had with President Macron and also President Biden, that the G7 comes together to, let's say, consider a capital increase for the World Bank to begin with, rather than saying that because of the political economy and the change in shares, etc. That, to me, would be an important sign. And then we can start talking about materiality, and we can start talking about the additional leverage that the DMD of the fund has been talking about. So to me, that is both symbolically and substantively important. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Last word to you, Beatrice.
I would suggest that topic could be that how to leverage the European carbon market for, let me start with Africa, and how to make, maybe expanding it in such a way that more countries could be part of it, not only through the incentive of CBAM, though that will help, I agree, but also more structurally. I would also suggest that the main question is how all these, because everybody has, there is probably no area where there is more goodwill, especially in Europe. But I would suggest that the topic should also be how do they scale in such a manner that we are not totally over budget. And that is a global question. And then I would hope that in the meantime, the EU, as I heard also today, the Commission starts really talking about the global problem. Because if we do not take the global problem seriously and the global limit that we are together facing, then I fear that there may be an increasing amount also of resistance within the EU because our share is just not so large and we are doing a lot inside. We still have to do that, right? But compared to every other place, it's not bad what is happening here, but it's obviously not enough. So I think the EU has to be in the leadership for the rest of the world in terms of having solutions and offering help and offering assistance that will add up.
Yeah. So it shouldn't just be European self-congratulation that by 2030 we'll be producing less than 5% of global emissions. True, but that actually we're still responsible for emissions elsewhere in the world thanks to our imports, and we are part of a global trading system which overall has to be decarbonised. So that gives us a great agenda to think about over the next 12 months until the next session, plus quite a lot of food for thought to accompany your drinks, which are outside in the room Terraken. Thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you.